The Earth, a planet of wonder hurtling across the vast space of a grand universe, home to the human race. There are countless awe-inspiring sights to behold, both on our planet as well as out among the stars. It comes then as little surprise to learn that these events have become the items of human fixation across countless works of verbal and visual art. However, they also fall victim to the predation of those who seek to saturate the true grandeur of existence with the cheap and unfounded mythos found across various religions. What is more is that where predictions laid down by the apparent all-knowing gods of the heavens do not match the nature of reality, it is up for those devoutly deluded to attempt to retrofit these passages in order to claim divine revelation. We shall be examining those claims found in the Bible and the Quran in attempts to fracture the very notion that these texts hold any transcendence, revealing that their authors lacked the ability to fathom the real nature of reality. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. The book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. During the formation of the world, one detail which betrays the Bible is the notion of vault or a firmament. This is supposedly a solid barrier suspended above the earth, across the sky like a tent or inverted fishbowl, keeping the waters of the heavens above out. What is alarming is that if this were to exist, keeping the rest of the universe out, it would also keep us in. There would be no space exploration, such as the Apollo missions, or even in arguing that there certainly would be no plans for interplanetary settlement as there currently are. What is more is that this is not the only passage in the Bible to discuss this area. In the book of Job, where God is talking to Job in chapter 28, verses 37 and 38, we get the following. Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens, when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together? We today, of course, know about the hydrological cycle. We understand the way in which water evaporates into the air and travels on the winds, condensing as cloud formations before precipitating down to earth and then making its way back to the ocean. Yet the authors of the Bible did not. This ignorance is okay. This would be reasonable for their time period. That is, if weren't for the fact that they claim to have access to and apparent revelation from the very creator of reality. The passage from Job going as far to be an apparent quote from said apparent all-knowing deity. This is what reveals the purely human origins of the Bible, these fingerprints of mankind left in the ignorance of divine scripture. And God said, Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, and days, and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. The book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 14 through 16. In the opening of the first book of the Old Testament, we get this glaringly obvious mistake. The mistake that the moon is a light source. This is so blatantly obvious as a mistake in the fact that the moon is in no way radiating its own light. The moon merely acts as a reflective surface, its reflective shape differing dependent on its alignment with the earth and the sun, hence its differing phases, whilst the shape and size of the moon remains constant. This is a mistake without excuse. If God were all-knowing, then he could have rather easily informed the Hebrews of this fact. The Hebrews, along with any civilization for that matter, would have been more than sufficient at processing this idea. If God needed, he could have made reference to the shining reflection on the water, or that in a polished shield. God could have even related the sun to himself, its shine being that of the glory in his presence, and the moon like that of one of his chosen prophets, casting what was once God's righteousness back down in literally their darkest hour. This could have been a metaphorical setup for the resurrection, as well as in the way that Christ conquered death in the same fashion that the sun at dawn conquers the night. There are so many ways, in fact, in which he could have explained the way in which the moon is not really a light, and yet not a single one was chosen. Instead, he supposedly took the route of holding the same ignorance as the native people of that era. Have you ever journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? The book of Job, chapter 38, verse 16. This passage is one which shows an even further lack of knowledge on the hydrological cycle. The idea that the seas and oceans have springs or sources. Though there are various attempts at retrofitting here, this is not the first time that such a case has been mentioned. If we turn to Genesis chapter 7 verse 11, it reads, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened." What this allows us to understand is that God is certainly not discussing the rivers from which water returns to the oceans, nor is he talking about the hydrothermal vents discovered on the ocean's floor in the 20th century. The Hebrews, these men who authored the Bible, were under the impression that, like surface springs which seem to magically appear from the earth, so it must be with the vast oceans. The idea almost seems to be made in reconciliation with the previous notion of a flat earth, a knock-on effect of the claim of a firmament. What's more is that the authors of the Bible seemed to be under the impression that God could increase or decrease the rates of these so-called fountains upon his wish, as was apparently so with the flood of Noah. This is a major factor which proves that this is not talk or revelation of the before-mentioned hydrothermal vents which merely force water that has managed to seep down into the crust back to the surface due to thermal pressure. There is no scope for variation dependent upon the will of some divine creator. All flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean by you. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat. Those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of those you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other flying insects that have 4 legs you are to regard as unclean. The book of Leviticus, chapter 11, verses 20 through 23. The religious, especially evangelicals, truly love to praise the Lord's apparent creation and just how much detail has been put into it. Yet, if God truly did exist and cared about such small matters, then surely he should know the mathematical difference between 4 legs the Bible claims flying insects have and the 6 legs they actually have. This mistake is such a seemingly simple one that it shows us just how little the authors of the Bible really knew, certainly not having any access to an all-knowing deity. Now, there have been various attempts to reconcile this passage, most notably the rather poor attempts to classify the back limbs of, say, a locust or grasshopper as something other than legs, possibly making reference to George Orwell's Animal Farm and the way in which the wings of geese are counted as legs, as they were used to move rather than manipulate. The problem with this is so glaringly obvious from the go. Firstly, the passage separates the two, stating that you may not eat the flying insects that walk on all fours, before going on to state that you may, however, eat those which walk on all fours, yet are any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, and grasshopper with the jointed leg. Ergo, whilst the excuse may be argued to work for those which you can eat, it does not cover the prior mention of those you may not. Said insects which you may not eat, lacking the special limbs required for said excuse. And he has set up on the earth mountains standing firm, lest it should shake with you, and rivers and roads, that ye may guide yourselves. The Quran, chapter 16, verse 15. And we have set on the earth mountains standing firm, lest it should shake with them, and we have made therein broad highways, for them to pass through, that they may receive guidance. The Quran, chapter 21, verse 31. The problem found in this passage is the concept that the mountains are there to prevent the shaking of the earth, whether in relation to the sky or the sea. However, the fact is this could not be further from the truth. Anyone who knows a basic amount of geography should understand that mountain ranges are typically the result of plate tectonics pushing against one another. Sometimes the plates continue to push up against one another, directly increasing the elevation of this collision point. In other instances, one plate slides beneath the other, especially if one is a thinner oceanic plate, and this pushes the plate on top higher and higher and can lead to volcanic activity. The thing is that all this activity can lead to snagging, two gigantic plates snagging on one another. With this, there is a build-up of pressure until the plates can no longer hold and they jerk free from one another, causing an array of seismic activity, least of all tremors, and in the most extreme of cases, sizable earthquakes. Therefore, this notion that it is the mountains which keep the earth in place, free of shaking, is one that doesn't stand up to the nature of reality. Till, when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a muddy spring, and found a people thereabout. We said, O Zulkarnain, either punish or show them kindness. The Quran, chapter 18, verse 86. This is possibly the passage that I hope I have to say the least about. The very notion that the sun sets in a muddy spring somewhere on the earth is one which outstands me in how blatantly inaccurate it is. Firstly, it is the claim that the sun is smaller than the earth, otherwise it would not fit. Secondly, it does not realize that the sun is so warm that it would never be able to set in a muddy spring. The water would evaporate instantaneously, and likely the parched earth itself left behind would either combust or disintegrate. And thirdly, it seems to be a revelation made in the absence of the knowledge that the sun is over 147 million miles away at its closest point of alignment. And he it is who sends the winds as good news before his mercy, and we send down pure water from the cloud. The Quran, chapter 25, verse 48. The idea that rainwater is pure is not an uncommon one. Even to this day, many people believe rain to be water purified. The problem with this, however, can be highlighted by looking at a limestone statue. Limestone, being composed of the crystal formations of calcium carbonate, are susceptible to chemical erosion, especially that caused by rain, particularly in areas near industrial development. The reason for this is that the gases sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide are reactive with water molecules, mixing with them in our atmosphere to give the water molecules a lower pH level, turning it acidic before raining down as acid rain. This effectively displays that the author of the Quran was somewhat ill-informed as to just how pure rain really is. And he it is who has let flow forth the two large bodies of water, one sweet and palatable, and the other salty and bitter. And he has set a barrier and an insurmountable forbidding ban that keeps them apart. The Quran, chapter 25, verse 53. He has set free the two seas meeting together. There is a barrier between them. They do not transgress. The Quran, chapter 55, verses 19 through 20. This is possibly one of the most contended of these scientific errors found in the Quran. Reason is that many Islamic apologists in fact attempt to utilize this passage, along with the fact that your average individual is not necessarily going to know particularly much about what they're being shown, in attempts to convert people. Often this passage will be accompanied by images that display a sudden shift in coloration between two bodies of water. These images can be the result of a number of factors, two of the rarer yet sometimes most striking being algae blooms or oil spills, yet most commonly they are the result of sediment deposition. One place that Islamic apologists like to reference is the Gibraltar Strait and the effect of the Gibraltar Sill on the Mediterranean Sea as it enters the Atlantic Ocean. This image in particular is one that apologists online enjoy distributing, and here is a better quality one from the Principles of Oceanography, which includes the salinity gradient. The problem with this example is the fact that the waters do mix. Just the rate of crossover from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic is so much that the water temporarily separates before slowly distributing the salinity more equally. There is no insurmountable forbidding ban, merely a partial barrier in the sill that slows down the rate of mixing. Another problem with this example can be found in the passage itself, in the statement that one of these waters is palatable and the other salty and bitter. Drink considerably from either of these two waters and you will die of dehydration. So where can the apologist turn from here? Well, in the images displayed we see a shift from not dark blue to light blue, yet from murky brown to clearer water. This effect can occur when two rivers from two differing regions meet, or as the river enters the sea. Now, of course, the passage mentions the meeting of salt and fresh water. However, these two cases are the result of the exact same phenomenon: sediment transportation. You see, the Yulstrom chart displays the relation between sediment size and the force required to erode, i.e. pick up, said sediment, which is in the upper segment of the chart, and the force below which sediment will be deposited, which is the lower segment of the chart. The sediment responsible for this brownish coloration is often a very fine silt. As this murky, silt-filled water enters the ocean, the river begins to lose its flow as it loses its energy. With this, there will come a point where the silt being carried will suddenly be deposited, creating a slow cascade effect down to the ocean floor. This gives off the illusion that there is a sudden barrier preventing the mixing, when in fact this very phenomenon occurs at the point where the fresh water has become so saturated and mixed with the salt water that it has lost its energy and therefore its capability for suspension. Given the right conditions, such as a dominant longshore drift, and over time this can form a spit across the mouth of a river. The claim that water does not mix is just one that does not stand up to scientific scrutiny. You merely have to look up the various estuary types, such as those displayed on screen, salt levels displayed as parts of 1,000, to see that they do in fact mix. Save in the case of number 4, but that is down to the riverbed having run dry. These regions where salt and fresh water mix, transgressing upon one another, are discussed in all fields of natural sciences, having everything to do with physics, chemistry, and even biology in the types of flora and fauna, e.g. the mangrove swamps, which play host to countless species which can only survive in brackish water. Often the last attempt at saving the Quran at this point comes in the form of a halocline. Haloclines exist in areas where there is little or no current to disturb the strong salinity gradient which has become stratified. This can be down to a number of reasons, e.g., surface evaporation causes water on the surface to have far higher levels of salt than the lower depths. Ice melt in the Arctic or water filtration from rainwater into underground caves connected to the sea leads to fresher water being on the surface. The problem is that whilst yes, there is a very steep gradient due to the lack of water motion which prevents efficient mixing, the two waters are still chemically mixing, merely slow enough to observe such a phenomenon. There is nothing magical here, certainly no insurmountable barrier across which water cannot mix, therefore proving once and for all that the Quran, just like the Bible, is not divinely written.